Your Honor, the claimant has no legal representation. Shall we proceed without her? The adjudicator looked up from her papers. Behind the respondent's table, a man in a tailored suit shuffled a stack of folders and did not bother to hide his smile. From the back of the room, a woman in a gray cardigan raised her hand. My name is Colette Arseneau. I am the claimant, and I would like to speak for myself, if the board will allow it. The man in the suit, Raymond Okafor, counsel for Northgate Property Solutions, glanced at her once. Then he looked back at his notes the way a person looks away from something that does not concern them. He would not make that mistake again. To understand how Colette got into that room, you have to go back 3 years to a Tuesday morning in October when the letter arrived. The Arseneaus had lived in the same house on Rideau Crescent in Brockville, Ontario since 1987. It was a wide, low house with a covered porch and a maple tree in the front yard that turned the color of a copper pot every fall. Colette's husband, Patrick, had planted that tree the year their daughter was born. He measured its height every Thanksgiving with a strip of painter's tape on the doorframe, the same way he measured the children. Patrick Arseneau had worked 31 years as a millwright at the paper mill east of town. He knew machines the way some men know scripture. Not just what they did, but what they meant, what they wanted, what sound they made when something was about to give. His hands were heavy and scarred in the way that honest work scars a person, and he wore those scars the same way he wore everything else, without comment. Colette had taught French and English at Brockville Collegiate for 22 years. She was the kind of teacher students remembered, not because she was easy, but because she was precise. She had no patience for vague answers. She had taught her students to say exactly what they meant and to mean exactly what they said, and she had never stopped practicing what she preached. Their son, Martin, was grown and living in Edmonton. Their daughter, José, had married a man named Curtis Whitmore and moved to a new development 12 minutes north of town. Curtis worked in commercial real estate. He wore collared shirts on weekends and talked about property values at dinner in the flat, careful tone of a man who believed numbers were the same thing as wisdom. The letter came on a Tuesday. Patrick opened it at the kitchen table while his coffee went cold beside him. It was from Northgate Property Solutions. It informed the Arseneaus, in 4 tidy paragraphs, that the strip of land along the east side of their property, the narrow stretch between the fence and the creek, the one Patrick had used as a kitchen garden for 15 years, did not belong to them. According to Northgate's survey, it belonged to the company, and Northgate intended to build a drainage easement through it as part of a larger development project beginning the following spring. Patrick read it twice. Then he called Curtis. Curtis came over that Sunday with a folder of his own and a look on his face that Colette recognized from parent-teacher interviews. It was the look of someone who had already decided what the answer was and needed you to agree. Pat, he said, sitting across the kitchen table and spreading papers like a man laying cards, I've talked to a few people in the industry. These boundary disputes, Northgate has done this before. They file a survey, they wait for the homeowner to either fight or fold, and 9 times out of 10 the homeowner folds. The legal costs alone, Patrick said. That land has been part of this property since before José was born. Curtis said, I understand that. But feelings don't hold up in a property tribunal. What holds up is documentation. And from what I can see, Northgate has a surveyor's certificate dated 2019 that puts that boundary line 3.4 meters east of where you thought it was. Colette was standing at the counter. She had not sat down since Curtis started talking. She said, What does the original deed say? Curtis glanced at her the way adults glance at children who have asked a question during a grown-up conversation. He said, Colette, these documents are complicated. The language goes back decades. She said, I know what a deed is, Curtis. What does ours say? He paused. He said he would look into it. He did not look into it. Patrick hired a local solicitor named Bernard Fowler, who came recommended by a man at the mill. Fowler was pleasant and slow, and produced a letter to Northgate that accomplished approximately nothing. Northgate's response was 14 pages long and written in the kind of language that is designed to be impossible to argue with and equally impossible to understand. It cited 3 provincial statutes, 2 tribunal precedents, and the 2019 survey twice. Fowler read the response and suggested they consider negotiating a settlement. He said these things were expensive to fight. He said Northgate had deep pockets and experienced counsel, and that sometimes the practical choice was the right one. Patrick said, "I don't want a settlement. I want my garden back." Fowler said he understood. Patrick died that February. It was his heart, which had been giving him warnings for 2 years, that he had chosen not to share with his family. He was 61 years old. He had been planning to retire in April. The maple tree stood in 2 feet of snow the morning they brought him home from the hospital. Colette sat on the porch in her coat and looked at it for a long time. The painter's tape was still on the doorframe inside. She had not had the heart to take it down. Martin flew in from Edmonton. José and Curtis came from their house 12 minutes north. They sat in the kitchen and drank tea and talked around the shape of things the way families do when grief is too large to hold directly. Curtis, who meant well in the way that people mean well when meaning well costs them nothing, said that given everything, it might be time to let the Northgate matter rest. That fighting a property tribunal was expensive and stressful, and that Colette was in no state to take it on alone. That Patrick would have wanted her to have peace of mind. Colette set down her mug. She said, "Patrick planted that garden the summer José learned to walk. He grew garlic and tomatoes and a kind of squash his mother used to make. He weeded it on his knees every spring for 15 years. And a company that did not exist when he first turned that soil is now telling me it belongs to them. I don't want peace of mind, Curtis. I want the truth." Curtis looked at José. José looked at her hands. Martin, who was quieter than his brother-in-law and watched things more carefully, looked at his mother and said nothing. He had seen that look before. He knew better than to argue with it. The property tribunal hearing was scheduled for September, 9 months away. Fowler had filed the original claim before Patrick died. After the funeral, he called to offer his condolences and to gently suggest, again, that a settlement might be the compassionate path forward. Colette thanked him for his sympathy and told him she would be representing herself. There was a silence on the line. She said, "I have 9 months. That is enough time to learn what I need to know." Fowler said that he strongly advised against it, that Raymond Okafor was a formidable opponent, that property law was a specialized field, that she would be at a severe disadvantage. She said, "Send me the full file, everything you have." He sent it the following week, 412 pages. She started reading that Sunday. The dining room table disappeared under photocopied statutes and survey maps within a fortnight. She ordered 2 books on Ontario property law and a 3rd on tribunal procedure. She read them the way she had once read student essay, with a red pen in her hand and no patience for imprecision. She had spent 22 years teaching people to read closely, to look at the thing in front of them, not the thing they expected to see, to notice what a sentence actually said, not what it seemed to say. She brought that same habit to the file. The thing that caught her attention first was not the survey. It was a footnote. Northgate's 2019 survey cited an original boundary demarcation from 1961. That demarcation was the founding document of the entire dispute, the thing every subsequent map had used as its reference point. Northgate's 14-page response quoted it 4 separate times. Colette wrote to the Brockville Land Registry Office and requested a copy. The copying fee came to $18. She paid it from the envelope she kept in the kitchen drawer for small expenses. The document arrived 2 weeks later. She sat at the dining room table, poured herself a cup of tea, and read it 3 times before she allowed herself to think about what it meant. Then she called Martin. She did not tell him what she had found. She had decided she would not say a word until she was certain. She asked him instead about a word, a term she had encountered in the document that she wanted to be sure she understood. "What does datum point mean?" she asked, in a survey context. Martin, who had done 2 years of engineering before switching to trades, explained it carefully. A datum point was a fixed physical reference, used as the starting measurement for everything else in a survey. Every distance, every boundary, every line on a map. All of it was calculated from that anchor, she asked. "And if the datum point itself is wrong?" There was quiet on the line. Then Martin said, "Mum, what are you looking at?" She said, "I'll tell you on Sunday." She spent the next 3 weeks with survey maps and a ruler, and the kind of patience that 22 years in a classroom builds in a person whether they want it or not. She cross-referenced the 1961 demarcation with the municipal road survey from 1978, which she found in the archives of the Brockville Recorder and Times on a Thursday afternoon when the paper's librarian, a slow-moving man named Walter, who had worked there since 1991, hauled a dusty binder from a back shelf and left her alone with it for 2 hours. The 1961 survey had used a concrete survey marker on the east side of Rideau Crescent as its datum point. The marker was described in the document with precise coordinates. The 1978 road survey, conducted when the city widened the road, noted in a single brief paragraph, a paragraph that no one in 17 pages of Northgate documentation had ever mentioned, that the original marker on Rideau Crescent had been removed during road construction and replaced with a new one, repositioned 2.8 meters to the east to accommodate the expanded curb line. Every survey conducted after 1978 had used the new marker. Every survey that referenced the 1961 demarcation had been measuring from the wrong point. The strip of land Northgate claimed, 3.4 meters east of where the Arseneaus believed their boundary to be, was, when corrected for the marker relocation, exactly where Patrick had always said it was. His garden had always been his. On the Sunday she had promised, Martin came from Edmonton. He sat at the dining room table and she laid it out for him. The 1961 document, the 1978 notation, the ruler measurements, the maps. She had drawn it out on graph paper in pencil, the way she used to diagram sentences on the blackboard. Martin did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "Mum, does Okafor know about the 1978 survey?" She said, "His 14 pages do not mention it once." Martin looked at the graph paper. He looked at his mother. He said, "We need to get this to a lawyer." She said, "I know, but I want to understand it well enough to explain it myself first. Because I know what happens when you hand something to someone else and trust them to carry it." She said it without bitterness. She said it the way a person states, a fact they have learned the hard way. She found Eleanor, not a retired lawyer this time, but something close. A retired land surveyor named Gordon Fitch, 73 years old, who had worked in Brockville for 4 decades before his knees gave out, and he started growing dahlias instead. He came recommended by Walter at the newspaper archive, who knew him from the Legion. Gordon came to the house on a Wednesday with a magnifying glass and his own ruler, and sat at the dining room table for 3 hours without saying much. At the end of the 3 hours, he said, "In 40 years I never saw anyone catch this." She said, "Is it enough?" He said, "It's more than enough. It's everything." She filed the amended evidence submission herself, under Fowler's file number but with her own name as representative. The tribunal registrar called to confirm and asked twice whether she understood she was proceeding without legal counsel. She said, "I understand." He said, "Northgate will have senior representation." She said, "I know." She spent the last 3 weeks before the hearing preparing the way she had once prepared lesson plans. Methodically, without shortcuts, knowing exactly where she wanted to arrive and building the path backward from there. She had one question. She had come to it the way her husband used to diagnose a machine, by listening past the obvious noise to the thing underneath it. She had written it out and crossed out 8 other versions before she settled on the one that mattered. She folded it and kept it in the pocket of her cardigan. The hearing room in the Brockville Government Services Building smelled of recycled air and new carpet. Colette arrived 20 minutes early. She set her folder on the claimant's table, placed Gordon Fitch's signed affidavit on top, and sat down. Raymond Okafor arrived with 2 junior associates and a trolley of files. He was a tall man, well-dressed, with the kind of face that had learned to project authority early and practiced it until it became effortless. He looked at the claimant's table once, registering the gray cardigan, the folder, the absence of counsel. He turned to his associates and said something she did not catch. One of them smiled. The adjudicator, a woman named Susan Theriot, called the hearing to order at 10 o'clock. She had a reputation in the tribunal that Colette had researched carefully. Patient, precise, unmoved by theater. Okafor opened for the respondents. He was smooth and well-prepared and had clearly done this many times. He cited the 2019 survey, the 3 provincial statutes, and the tribunal precedents. He spoke for 22 minutes and said nothing his 14-page letter had not already said, but he said it with a confidence that filled the room. Theriot turned to the claimant's table. "Miss Arseneau, you may proceed." Colette stood. She said, "Thank you, Your Honor. I would like to begin with a document that is already in evidence. The 1961 boundary demarcation cited 4 times in Northgate's own submission." She walked them through it plainly. The datum point, the marker, the 1978 road widening, the relocation notation on page 3 of the municipal survey, in a paragraph that took up 4 lines and had never, in any of Northgate's 17 years of corporate surveying history, been mentioned in a single filing. Okafor objected 3 times. Theriot overruled twice and sustained once on a point of form that Colette corrected without blinking. When she finished the technical portion, she said, "I would like to call one witness. Mr. Gerald Ossie, former senior surveyor with the City of Brockville Public Works Department, retired 2018. His affidavit is Exhibit D. He is available in person if the board requires." Gerald Ossie was 67, slow-moving, impeccably dressed, and had the manner of a man who had spent 30 years saying careful things in formal rooms. He had worked on the 1978 road widening. He remembered the marker relocations, specifically because there had been a dispute about it at the time. 2 neighboring residents had objected to the repositioning, and he had written the notation himself to create a record. Okafor cross-examined him for 11 minutes. He asked whether the notation had ever been flagged in a boundary dispute before. Gerald said no, to his knowledge. He asked whether a layperson could have located this document without professional assistance. Gerald said that the 1978 survey was a public record, available from the city archive for the cost of copying. Okafor sat down. Theriot looked at the claimant's table. "Ms. Arseneau, you have one further question for the witness, I believe." Colette stood. She did not open her folder. She took the folded sheet from her cardigan pocket, but she did not unfold it. She knew what was on it by heart. She looked at Gerald Ossie the way she had once looked at students who were about to tell her something important without knowing it. "Mr. Ossie," she said, "when your department relocated the survey marker in 1978, did you notify the Land Registry Office that the datum point for Rideau Crescent boundary calculations had changed?" The room went quiet. Gerald looked at her. He looked at the table. He had the expression of a man who has been asked a question he has not thought about in 40 years, and who is now thinking about it very carefully. He said, the standard practice at the time was to file the road survey with the municipal office. The land registry notification, he paused, was the responsibility of the contracted surveyor. "And do you know whether that notification was filed?" He said, slowly, that he did not know, that it had been a contracted role, that the city had assumed it was done. Because if it was not filed, Colette said, and her voice was even and unhurried, then every boundary survey conducted on Rideau Crescent for the past 47 years has been referencing a datum point whose relocation was never formally recorded with the provincial registry. and every error that followed from that, including Northgate's 2019 survey, would trace back not to a disagreement about where the line is, but to an administrative gap in the public record. She paused. "That is not a boundary dispute," she said. "That is a recording error, and the law is quite specific about which party bears the burden in a recording error." The silence had weight to it. Okafor was on his feet. He said something about the scope of examination. Theriot raised one hand without looking at him. "Ms. Arseneau," Theriot said, "are you submitting that the original deficiency is not in the survey itself but in the registration chain?" "Yes, Your Honor. Do you have documentation of the notification requirement as it stood in 1978? Colette placed Exhibit E on the table. It was a photocopy of the Ontario Surveys Act, 1970, Section 14, Subsection 3. She had found it in the Brockville Public Library's Law Reference section on a Saturday afternoon in July. The librarian had been surprised to see someone using those shelves. Colette had asked for a photocopy card and spent $4. Theriot studied the exhibit. She studied it for a long time. Then she said, "We will take a recess. 40 minutes. Nobody in the room moved quickly. People stood and stretched and spoke in low voices, but nobody left because the room had the feeling of something unfinished that everyone wanted to see finished. Colette sat at her table. She put the folded paper back in her pocket. She did not look at Okafor. She looked at the window where a maple tree on the far side of the government parking lot had begun to turn. Martin was in the gallery. He had flown in from Edmonton 2 days before and had not said much since. He found her eyes across the room and held them for a moment. He looked like his father when he did that. The same stillness. José was beside him. She had come without Curtis, who had a showing that morning he said he could not cancel. She had been crying a little, quietly, in the way that people cry when they did not expect to be moved. In the corridor, Colette found Gerald Osey by the water fountain. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at nothing. He said, "Mrs. Arseneau, I want you to know, I have thought about that marker every few years for a long time. I always assumed the notification went through. I should have checked. I should have." She put her hand briefly on his arm. "You came today," she said. "That is the part that matters now." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. When Theriot returned to the bench, she sat without preamble and read from the papers in front of her. "This board finds that the boundary dispute brought by Northgate Property Solutions is founded on a chain of surveys originating from a datum point whose relocation in 1978 was not formally registered with the Provincial Land Registry Office in accordance with the requirements of the Ontario Surveys Act then in force. The 2019 Northgate survey, while technically accurate as measured from the existing marker, does not establish legal boundary entitlement because the marker itself has no registered provenance as a replacement for the original 1961 datum." She set down the first page and took up the second. "The board further finds that the land in question, the strip of 3.4 meters along the eastern boundary of the property at 14 Rideau Crescent, Brockville, has been in continuous and uncontested use by the registered owners of that property since at least 1987, and likely earlier. There is no documentation of any claim, formal or informal, to that strip prior to Northgate's 2019 filing." She looked up. "The claim by Northgate Property Solutions is dismissed. The registered boundary of the property at 14 Rideau Crescent shall revert to the line established by the original 1961 demarcation, corrected for the 1978 marker relocation, as documented in the municipal survey of that year. Costs are awarded to the claimant." The gavel came down once, and the room exhaled. Martin reached her first. He put both arms around her in the way he had not done since he was a teenager, and she held on. José came right behind. She was crying properly now and not trying to hide it. Someone from the gallery, one of the neighbors from Rideau Crescent, who had heard and come, started to clap. Then a few others. It was not applause exactly. It was the sound a room makes when it has been holding its breath for too long. Okafor gathered his files. He was professional about it, moving with the efficiency of a man who has lost before and knows how to leave a room without showing it costs him. At the door he paused. He turned and looked at Colette from across the room. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, very slightly, and walked out. Theriot came down from the bench. It was not something that happened in that building, and the bailiffs glanced at each other. She stopped in front of Colette and offered her hand. "I have presided over property hearings for 16 years, she said. "I have seen experienced barristers miss what you found today." She paused. "What was it that pointed you toward the 1978 survey?" Colette thought about it for a moment. "My husband always said, when the answer doesn't make sense, you haven't found the right question yet." She looked at the window, at the maple tree going copper in the parking lot. "I just kept asking questions until I found the one that fit." The costs awarded covered Fowler's original fees and then some. Colette used a portion to have the boundary line professionally surveyed and registered. Properly this time, with every document filed, every box checked. A paper trail that would not need to be excavated by anyone's widow 40 years from now. She replanted the garden the following May. Garlic first, because that was what Patrick had always started with. Then tomatoes along the south fence, and a kind of squash she had found in a seed catalog that looked, from the photograph, like the one his mother used to make. She was not sure it was right. She would find out in August. Martin came for Thanksgiving that year. He measured himself against the doorframe, and they laughed at the painter's tape that was still there. She left it. She had decided it was not the kind of thing that needed to come down. José came too, without Curtis, and then later with Curtis, who shook Colette's hand at the door and said, very quietly, that he was sorry he had underestimated her. She accepted it for what it was. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had learned to trust numbers more than people, and that was not the worst fault a person could have. Gordon Fitch sent her a card with a dahlia on the front. He wrote, in his careful engineer's hand, 40 years. Never saw anyone catch it. It will be on your property record now. No one takes it again. She put the card on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a maple leaf. On a Friday evening in October, when the air had gone clean and cold the way it does in the St. Lawrence Valley at the end of things, Colette sat on the covered porch with a cup of tea and watched the maple tree. It was the same copper as the kettle on the stove, the same copper as every October she could remember. Patrick had planted it the year José was born. She had kept it. So here is my question for you, and I would like you to think about it honestly. If you had been in that hearing room when a woman in a gray cardigan with a folder and no lawyer stood up to face a senior counsel and a trolley of files, would you have believed she could win? Or would you have already decided what the answer was before she opened her mouth? Be honest in the comments. We all carry assumptions about who is allowed to know things, and sometimes the most dangerous word in a hearing room is obvious. Because the obvious answer is the one nobody bothered to check. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are more stories like this one, and I will keep telling them. Because the truth has a way of sitting quietly in a public archive, waiting for the person patient enough to find it.